Welcome back, everyone. This is the second session, and our final session. This is our sixth panel of the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Bridging the Divide on Artificial Intelligence. Focus today on AI ethics norms, security studies at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Really look forward to building on the session from this morning. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Oona Hathaway, in this moment. Introduce our distinguished panelists from Shapiro. We're accustomed to the technical setup here in the room. If you are joining us virtually, please remember you can submit your written questions. We'll incorporate those as we go, and of course, we're also recording and we'll distribute that. Thank you, everyone. Professor Oona Hathaway is our forum director. She's a partner in developing this forum system. Its inception. She is the Gerard Bernice Professor of International Law, Director, Center for Global Challenges at Yale Law School, back member of Jackson Institute. Joined by for this session. Brian Christian is an acclaimed author and leading authority on technical challenges associated with AI and emerging technologies. Campus from the West Coast. He's in residence as a fellow at Berkeley. His book, The Alignment Problem, Machine Learning Values, is a really interesting blend of history and reporting. It traces the explosive growth of machine learning, a wide range of resulting risks and opportunities. Consequences. Is a finalist for Best Science and Technology Book of the Year of the LA Times. And there are some copies on our way out the door. Maybe if you're back time for Brian, we're delighted that he could be with us. He's the author of previous bestsellers, The Most Human, as well as Algorithms Live. And we're delighted to have Professor Shapiro here to join us. He's Yale's Charles F. Southmayd Professor of Philosophy as well. His areas of interest include jurisprudence, international law, constitutional law, criminal law, and of course cybersecurity. He's authored numerous articles along with Professor Hathaway, co-author of The Internationalists: How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War, Remake the World. Really outstanding research on law students with requisite technical fluency to grapple with cybersecurity challenges. Also founding the U.S. Cyber Lab and working on his next book, Insecurity, detailing history and technology. It's another member of our forum join us, as well as Brian for making the West Coast trip. I'm going to turn it over to Oona here to kick off our last and final session. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's great to have this conversation with these two scholars and thinkers about these important questions of AI ethics and norms. So I wanted to start with Brian. So Brian, your first book, The Most Human, opens with a great anecdote where you describe participating in a Turing test. I wonder if you could tell that story and tell us a little bit about what you think it reveals about the state of AI.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So this goes back to the late 2000s, and I found myself in a very unusual position, which was that I was the human control subject in a Turing test competition. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Turing test, this goes back to a 1950 paper of Alan Turing's where he said, you know, could machines someday think? And if so, how would we know? And he proposed this practical experiment known as the Turing test today, where you have a panel of judges and they're essentially in a chat room and they're exchanging text messages on the one hand with a random person hidden in a room down the hall, and in the other window with a computer program claiming to be the random person hidden in the room down the hall. And Turing says, you know, we will reach a point probably by the beginning of the 21st century where the average person having these two dialogues won't know which one is the human and which is the imposter. And of course, the AI community loves turning these things into actual practical events. So since the early 90s, there's been an annual Turing Test competition. And I managed to finagle myself into the 2009 version of this as what's called the Human Confederate. And so it was my job to have a 5-minute long chat room conversation with these various scientists and attempt to persuade them that I was in fact a human being. And so this was a very surreal and interesting experience. The contest gives out an award every year to the computer program that does the best job of fooling the judges. But there is also, very strangely, an award that goes to the actual human that did the best job of persuading the judges that they were a human being. And this is called the Most Human Award. And so I found myself, in effect, competing not only against the chatbots, but also against the other people. And I think to your question, Oona, of how that situates us in kind of the context we find ourselves in now, I think it's pretty fair to say that with the rise of large language models like Drago was talking about in the previous panel, we can consider the Turing test kind of in the rearview mirror. People's opinions will differ, but in my view, I think we're there. And what does it mean to be effectively in a post-Turing test world? You know, so Alan Turing imagines this as a kind of thought experiment with these philosophical stakes of how will we know when machines can think. I don't think that Alan Turing would have been able to imagine that in the year 2022, Turing tests are essentially like one of the annoying chores of being like a person who's on the internet. Like anytime you get an email that's asking you for some kind of personal information, right? Elena was talking about trust and phishing and these sorts of things. We are essentially being conscripted into the role of a judge in a Turing test. You know, is this text message from my wife telling me she needs our bank PIN or something? Is that really her? You know, and likewise, when I send an email, a text message to someone asking for some potentially sensitive piece of information, I'm now being conscripted into being the human confederate in a kind of Turing test, where I find myself, I don't know if this is an experience that you all have, needing to performatively like enact some quirks of my own linguistic style as a way to convince the person like it's really me, right? So in the 90s or the early 2000s, I could write an email that just said, you know, oh, here's a link that you might find interesting, :URL. Nowadays, if you write an email that's that sort of impoverished, it'll get trapped in someone's spam filter, or then you'll get a message back from them that's like, hey, is this you? You know, is this really you? And so I think that to me is one of the really dramatic things about the Turing test, is that it has become this ritual in which we are all engaged, you know, many times a day. That's great.
I want to turn to your most recent book, which was mentioned earlier, The Alignment Problem, Machine Learning and Human Values. So this is sort of fast forwarding to pretty close to the present. This is recently came out. I think it's kind of addressing the next kind of generation of problem. Can you tell us a little bit about what the alignment problem is that you're describing in your book?
Yeah, so this was touched on a little bit in the previous panel, but the alignment problem is basically, how can we ensure that the numerical objective that a machine learning system has actually reflects the human intention of what we want to use the system for? And this is an idea that goes back to MIT cyberneticist Norbert Wiener in the 1960s, but is really coming to a head in the last several years with the rise of deep learning and machine learning more generally. So to give you a concrete example, many people in machine learning are training these models to play video games, Atari games, Super Mario Brothers, Space Invaders, etc. And they use the in-game score counter as the metric that they ask the system to optimize. And in many games, this works perfectly well. And so you can have AI that's superhuman at Space Invaders and Pong and all these things. But there are many games, as it turns out, in which single-mindedly pursuing maximizing your score does not actually beat the game. And a famous example of this is there's a boat racing game called Coast Runners. And there's a team at OpenAI training a deep reinforcement learning agent to play this game. And to their horror, they watch as it veers off of the racecourse and just ends up in this little harbor where there's a bunch of these power-ups. And it's just doing donuts in this harbor, collecting power-ups again and again and again. And this experience of the system is doing what we kind of numerically specified. We said maximize points, but what we meant was beat the game. So this is the alignment problem. There's this gap between what we've actually operationalized and what we sort of hoped the system would do. And in economics and management literature, this is like one of the oldest sins in the book. It's like creating an incentive system for A while hoping for B. And so you see this in a more practical context, as Drago was saying, and as we were talking in the previous panel, with the rise of large language models. And these are what's called pre-trained with a kind of fill in the blanks objective. So there's a huge corpus of text that's mined off of the internet and books and so forth. And you feed it to the system with words deleted. And you're basically saying, predict the missing word in this existing piece of text. And it develops these representations that are useful for all sorts of things. But there's a difference between the narrow objective of predict a missing word and the way that we actually hope these systems to be used. So, of course, the internet is full of toxic speech. And so if you begin typing something that has even a whiff of toxicity, the program, which has this single-minded objective of like Mad Libs, plug in the missing word, is going to start plugging in words that you maybe wouldn't have wanted. And this is a problem. What I think is very significant about the alignment problem is that it's a problem that gets worse rather than better as the power of the models improves. And so what we're seeing right now with, for example, GitHub Copilot, which is a Microsoft product that will use large language models to auto-complete your code, for example. So as you're typing in a function, it sort of fills in the rest of the function. But a lot of the code available online has bugs in it, or it's insecure, it has attack issues. And a really smart, really sensitive language model will know that buggy code usually appears in context of other buggy code. And so if you start to write something that has a bug in it, it will then begin auto-completing with more bugs. And so this is, again, a real world example of the alignment problem rearing its head. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we're going to want to explore, is this relationship between human intention and AI. And Scott's project is, I think, kind of coming at the same question from a different direction, but we'll get that to that in a moment. I mean, I think I'm particularly interested in the way in which AI, so as I understand the way you're describing the alignment problem, it's really the question about how do we get AI to do what we want it to do, more or less, right? So it's that we have a human intention about what we intend the AI to achieve, but AI is not necessarily designed to do that because it's working on patterns, and the patterns may be ones that are inconsistent with the intention that we actually have for the overall program. We have a very hard time specifying all the parameters such that it'll actually do what we want it to do. Is that a layman's, fair layman's
I think that's right.
Interpretation? So what are the implications of these differences, for instance, of these issues, for instance, in questions like criminal justice? So there's efforts to use AI and machine learning in criminal justice. Can you say a little bit about what kinds of challenges that these problems pose in that kind of context?
Yes. So there's a now almost 100-year history of using statistical and algorithmic predictive methods in criminal justice. It goes back to the late 1920s. But we have really seen in the last 2 decades this exponential increase, including many states mandating the use of these tools for things like pretrial detention, probation, and so forth. There's so many different intersecting issues that could be a whole conversation. But as a starting point, I think there's a fundamental issue in any machine learning system, which is the data that you observe is not necessarily the thing that you actually care about. And that's a kind of alignment problem in itself. And so in the context of criminal risk assessment, the model can observe things like, is this person arrested? Is this person convicted? But the model does not know if they're actually guilty. It doesn't know if people committed crimes for which they were not arrested. It doesn't know if people were, framed or et cetera. And so there's a critical gap that forms between what the model's predicting and what we mean for the model to be used for. And we often talk about them as risk prediction or recidivism prediction models, but it is much more rigorous to call them arrest prediction models. And I think that makes much more clear that, for individuals in a community where they face greater proportional risk of arrest, given a certain amount of crime taking place, the model will predict the risk, quote unquote, of arrest as being much higher, which doesn't necessarily mean that that individual is riskier to society. So that is, again, a classic example of the system is optimizing for something which is not exactly the thing that we actually care about. And we elide that distinction at our peril, I think.
Well, and that generates things like racial bias, gender bias, and the like, right? So if someone gets a higher sentence just merely because they're male or merely because they're a certain racial group that tends to get a higher sentence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're more culpable.
Yes.
And so figuring out how to address those, that translates into people being deprived of their freedom for lengthier periods of time, which is, a real fundamental moral and ethical problem for our criminal justice system to the extent that it's relying on these. So I wonder if you could just illuminate for us. So that's one obvious moral, ethical, and legal danger that we are already facing. What are some other moral, ethical, and legal dangers that you anticipate this alignment problem is going to create for us as AI becomes more widespread? Sort of what's not just the dangers that we face now, but what are some dangers that are ahead?
Yeah, I'm following the space of language models very closely. I think we are really just at the beginning of that. And one of the panelists mentioned the deluge of fake comments in FCC filings or comment applications. That is, to my knowledge, one of the first case studies in what happens when you can produce essentially, human-like sort of Turing Test passing text at scale. I'm frankly surprised that our public textual discourse has not already been rendered useless. Like, I'm sort of waiting for the moment where Reddit and Twitter become just like unusable because there's an infinite amount of these sorts of things. Like it's well within the reach of any PhD student or, motivated hacker to take one of these language models and to kind of fine tune it on how to produce Reddit comments that are highly upvoted, but which also have a slightly pro-Western or anti-Western or, pick your, pro-company X, anti-competitor Y slant. And so I'm waiting for that shoe to drop, and maybe it already has, and we're just not aware of it. But I think it is going to be a major challenge to think about how public discourse survives that, and whether we're going to have to make, Twitter has talked about having some sort of, Jack Dorsey has talked about having a green check mark next to your name that says, like, this is definitely a human being, not a bot. And it's not clear exactly how you would implement that. It's not clear to me what the privacy trade-offs are going to have to be. So if we require, further authentication for everything, is there going to be a kind of a necessary privacy trade-off that we have to make, or we're asked to make in return for limiting disinformation in some way?
So
I think that's a big issue.
Yeah. Well, so we have to prove that we're the most human on Twitter.
In effect.
Speaking of which, Scott Shapiro might win that test if anybody follows him on Twitter. So turning to you, Scott. I want to kind of maybe pick up with you where we just left off. Can you say a bit about what you see as the big challenges that we face in sort of squaring our commitments to principles in adjudication, not just in criminal justice, but more generally in law and decision-making, with the fact that machine learning is necessarily unprincipled and largely operates on pattern matching? So how do we square that circle, or is it possible to do so?
Thanks a lot. And by the way, I've always gone for the least human. First of all, so thanks for having me. I think I've spoken at every event
Yes, you have.
before, but now I'm talking about AI, and so I just want to first of all say that, like, you know, I'm new to this field, so I'm going. This is going to be more like, you know, kind of philosopher walks into an AI lab talk. So I would say, like, a lot of the discussion that we've had today focuses on AI's use in what you might call unprincipled decision making. Well, we don't really care if it's based on principle. We just care if it's right, ish. So natural language processing, you know, safety issues, autocompletes on Google, safety issues, facial recognition, you know, like that's just like that. We don't care if there's a principle behind that. We just care that it matches it correctly. But there's also this dream, and it has been a dream, you know, for centuries, that logic first and then now machine learning can be used to answer questions that exist in a different kind of realm, like the courtroom. So the way I came up with this, I was asked to moderate this panel that Eugene Bullock, a professor at UCLA, was giving about AI and judges, and it's a fantastic title. It was called Chief Justice Robots. For people who don't know, Chief Justice Roberts is the joke, but and he tried to argue, he argued that if we could figure out some AI system that would give better decisions in legal cases, then we should do it. And I guess I was really horrified by that. Like, imagine going into a courtroom and then they give you the slip and it says you're guilty. You're like, why? Well, here's the vector. You know, like what would that even mean? Like in what sense would that be a courtroom? You know, let me just give an example that Ronald Dworkin gave. It doesn't have to do with speed and efficiency, but it has to do with compromise, and just give you a sense of like how bizarre this is. So he gave this very famous example of what he called checkerboard statutes. And a checkerboard statute, so his example was abortion, the women's right for reproductive freedom. What if we had a statute that said, you know, half of the states can do it, half the states can't? It would be a federal statute, okay? And I think he said, and I think that's right, both sides would feel not just like aggrieved, but also that this was a perversion, okay? Even though, like, no matter if you got 50% more for your side, whatever that side is, still think like, wait a second, we can't make decisions like this. You know, there's no principle behind it. And so one of the things that I find really challenging and interesting, and I think really goes to foundations of what we're after here, is how could we take these pattern matching algorithms which produce fast and relatively accurate results in a situation where that's not the only thing we care about. We care about justification. I mean, think about what a courtroom is. It's a site where people make claims, and then some state body engages in what we might call, depending on the type of case, a societal condemnation or recognition of action. How do we do that with a you know, an n-dimensional vector of 300 weights? I mean, I have thoughts about that, but that I think is an enormous problem, which like nobody's kind of dealing with. But it's like, you know, that is part of what it is to adapt artificial intelligence to real world human problems.
Yeah, so I want to follow up on sort of how we make progress on that question, which is a project that you've undertaken with colleagues in the computer science department here at Yale. You've formed this automated reasoning group that I understand is trying to make some actual progress on these challenges. And I think bringing together kind of philosophical insights and these kinds of questions that you're raising here with the kind of technical expertise that's necessary to really understand the kind of underlying technology and sort of what's possible. So can you say just a bit about that project? There may be students in the room who are interested in this. And this also goes, I will say, to the kind of general purpose of this forum in the first place, which is thinking about how do we make progress on the hardest questions by bringing experts from philosophy, law, computer science, policy, together in the room, because none of these fields individually is going to be able to kind of solve these really hard problems. So can you say just a bit about what you all are doing and kind of how it is that you're actually trying to make some progress here?
Right, yeah, no, so I'll just say, yes, like I do think this is like an interdisciplinary project in the extreme, not our project, which is also interdisciplinary in the extreme, but I mean, in general, I mean, we're trying to go from basic philosophical, like first principles in philosophy to like how to implement the symbolic execution engine CLE using floating points. So it really is like this, from soup to nuts kind of thing. Let me just tell you what the project was. I mean, the NSF had a call out for accountability in software, and was contacted by computer science would interested in. Big first question was, what is accountability in software? Like, what is the question? And so we got to make up the question. We got the grant. Let me just tell you what accountability for the comp sci people here, it has a general meaning in security, and that generally it's like the ex post enforcement of security policies. So normally we think about cybersecurity, but it's kind of stopping things ex ante. So if you don't have permission to access this, you can't access it. But like, you could do it the other way. You could be like, you accessed it, therefore you're losing. We're going to take away the data from you and we're going to shut down your account or something like that. That's accountability. And I thought, well, no, actually, could we ask a more interesting question? Like, should that self-driving car be held accountable? And so the question then became, well, what would that mean? And so thought, well, what's the very first question you would ever ask? I actually made a slide. So it's two self-driving cars, and one hits the other. And so, like, what would be the accountability question you would ask? Well, the most obvious question you would ask is, we call it the ego car. The ego car is the one that does the hitting. Did the ego car intend to hit the victim car? I thought, okay, that's like then if we could solve that problem, we could start asking recklessness, negligence. We could ask a lot of prox liability. We can ask a lot of things, but it's just like the first thing, did it intend to? And so that's really hard. What the question is, can we take the folk psychological concepts like intention, belief, desire, and see whether it can be imputed to the model? And you say, well, no, it can, obviously, because they're machines, but like, we're neural, like we have neural nets, they're called neurons. So that, like, we do it to each other all the time. So what's the idea? So the idea was like, how do you know somebody's intending to do something? How do you know I intended to speak here today? Well, I came here today. Well, okay, that's not enough. Let's ask counterfactually, what if the front door was locked? Well, I might go around to the back door. Well, I would like text Oona, like, why is the door locked? I come down here and there's no one in the room. So I start looking around for other rooms. So these kind of counterfactual questions. And so we first built a self-driving car model, which kind of encoded this stuff directly, just a bunch of if-then statements. And then we queried it, like what if you thought, what if the ego car saw that the signals meant that it would hit the car if it kept on going. And of course, the test that we use would indicate, yes, that this car intended or not. But that wasn't that interesting because we had encoded the logic, the decision logic in the code itself. So what we did was, by we, I mean, I could just say like we, meaning like I wasn't doing the coding, okay? The group is the principal investigators are Ruzhika Piskak, computer science department, Samuel Judson, grad student, a bunch of other people. And so we get together every week and we talk about it. So what we did was we then took we took 2 cars and we trained one to be pathological, and we trained another to be normal. And we just gave the engine the question, which one is the pathological one and which one is the normal one. And what it would do is it would perturbate the inputs, the parameters. Okay, so like the ego car senses the other car in front of it. It sees that there's no left turn signal. It knows how fast it's going. So you create the circumstances counterfactually, okay, and ask, would it still hit the car? And the engine can determine whether it's going to hit the car or not hit the car, despite the fact that like when Drago showed that vector, right, and it like that looks meaningless. The same thing would be for the car. It would look meaningless. And the same thing for your brain. It would look meaningless. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to create kind of tests for folk psychological concepts that have been very well studied in philosophy, okay? Because counterfactual dependence on intentions is one of the many tests. And so the question is, how do we make it more and more sophisticated? Anyway, that's the way we've been trying to do it.
I want to just, you've sort of answered this already, but it's complex and important, I think. So I want to just ask you to dig in just a little bit more on this idea of intent, because it is something we think of as kind of fundamentally human, this idea of having an intention. And you've said a bit about it, but I want to invite you to say a little bit more, just because I think that it's challenging to think of a computer or an AI or machine learning model as having intent. And you said very quickly, like, we're in a sense machine learning models, right? Like the human brain is. Like, so you say a little bit more about how we think about intent in the kind of philosophical sense, and therefore how we can think about intent as applied to AI, machine learning, so because the premise, I guess, of this project is that is not just a fundamentally human thing.
Yes.
Right. And that's, I think, the first question we have to ask in terms of thinking about whether, there's ethics and accountability and, these kinds of questions, like, is there such a thing as intent for these models? So can you say just a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Of course. So that's a great question. So people used to think that the mind was the brain, and it can't be. I mean, this is the failure of the identity thesis. Don't worry, like, I'm not going to say something really weird right now, but the idea was the mind can't be the brain, the human brain, because, well, like, Martians have brains too. I mean, actually, I mean, God knows whether they have brains given the overpopulation problem. But if there were Martians, okay, and they had brains, we would think, oh, well, they have minds too if they were sophisticated enough. So what has happened in the last, I would say, 50 years in philosophy, 50, 60 years, is that the dominant, not universal, but the dominant view is what's been called functionalism, which is what you try to do is you try to characterize and individuate mental states and typify the type of propositional attitudes, was a belief, desire, intention, by its input-output relations, okay? Like, so it's an intention if not only given these inputs, you go get the beer, but counterfactually, had it been hard to get the beer, you would have worked out another way to try to get the beer. So the idea being that mental states aren't identified with specific neural correlates because we want to be able to believe, we want to allow for the possibility that there's multiple realizability. You know, silicone could manifest it, you know, carbon-based things can manifest, I mean, lots of things can manifest it. And so, you know, a functionalist view about the mental states like works really well for computer programs, and certainly neural models. I'd be curious whether anyone's else trying to do it because it's such an obvious thing to do. I'm kind of surprised. I mean, I'd be surprised if we're the only ones that are trying to do it. Although, I don't, you know, if you know, please don't tell me. What I would also say is, some people, some lawyer types, have said to us, like, why are you even bothered trying to figure out what the car thinks? It's just going to be products liability anyway. You're just going to, you know, they're just going to sue Tesla. And I thought, and the answer to that is maybe they won't. I mean, who knows, like who knows what the regime will be. But ultimately, we're going to have to face this question because we live in, most people think that despite the fact that the world is deterministic, like there are physical laws that determine what we do, we can still, at a certain level of complexity, say, oh, you're free, you have free agency. And we do that with human beings all the time, despite the fact that we know that we're deterministic automata. That means that eventually we're going to have to start doing this for artificial persons. And so might as well start now.
So let me follow up on that. Just one more question on this, and then maybe I'll give Brian an opportunity because I see him jotting down some notes if he wants to say anything about it, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if we adopt this functional model of intent, which is a kind of fundamental legal concept as well as a kind of concept in ethics and morals, it would suggest that actually we can have more visibility into intent with these models than we can with a human being, because you can just endlessly query it and it can't lie.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas human beings lie, obfuscate, et cetera. So can you say a bit about that? Because if that's the case, we actually can have a much better idea of accountability, you know, because we can judge intent with greater certainty.
I mean, our colleague Gideon Yaffe, who started the project with us, and he does, he's a philosopher, great philosopher, but he also does neuroscience. And I say to him, like, why the hell are you working at neuroscience trying to figure out what's inside the brain? I can give you a brain and you still won't know what to do. And what's really exciting about this is, like, the thought is, well, you know, the self-driving car is a black box. How are we going to ever determine what it's supposed to do? But if actually it's a crystal clear box, because we know all the weights, we know everything, we know all the neural connections. We just don't know the questions yet to ask it. But philosophers philosophers spent forever trying to come up with, how do we understand each other? Well, why can't we use the techniques for how we understand each other and apply it to a neural net where we can get the answer? So I kind of feel like if this works, we're at the golden age, you know, where we can start just creating test models, training it in these sorts of ways, and then asking, what's it intend? What does it believe? What are its desires? And so I think it's super exciting because you get something that you couldn't. So the unexplainability of AI, to me, depends on a theoretical claim that I'm not sure is true. It looks, if you look at it, it looks unexplainable, but you're not asking the right questions. If you were asking the right questions, you might be able to get a much better read on it than you could ever get for your friend.
That's great. So Brian, I don't know if you have any comments or questions, or before we turn it over to the rest of the group.
Yeah, I really, I'm really interested in, Scott, how you're thinking about this from a philosophical and legal perspective, because, as you say, fundamentally, we have this question of accountability for human beings where we don't know what's going on in our own minds. There's a wealth of data from cognitive scientists showing that people will confabulate their own reasons for doing things. We don't know why we do things, and we make it up after the fact. And yet society has, somewhat not gone off the rails so far. And so we can learn something. I think that's a very well argued that, the mechanisms that exist in that space can be just as applicable, if not more so. And I think from my perspective, I think there's several unique advantages that machine learning systems have from an accountability perspective. So in thinking about something like intention, so within what's called reinforcement learning, which is these systems that take a sequence of actions in order to maximize some numerical rewards. So self-driving cars fall under that rubric. There are two schools of reinforcement learning. There's what's called model-based reinforcement learning and model-free reinforcement learning. So the names tell you basically what they are, but in model-based reinforcement learning, there's an actual model that the system has of the world. And so it can extrapolate forward to what it thinks is going to happen as a result of its own behavior. So the canonical example in my mind is something like AlphaGo or AlphaZero, where it would think about a move in the board game context and then project out this huge tree of possible things. And it's like, okay, if I do this, then the other person will do that, then I do this, that, this, that. And so you can say in a model-based system, like, what did you think you were trying to do? What was the state of the world that you expected to encounter as a result of taking the action you were going to take? In contrast, you have what's called model-free reinforcement learning, which the canonical version of this is the system that DeepMind built to play Atari games. And in a model-free scenario, you have essentially what I would think of as a kind of muscle memory. So a certain image comes up on screen. The system says, when that sort of pattern happens, I press A because I know A will get me more points in the future. But it has no way of saying, like, in what way is that better? It just has this kind of muscle memory trigger. And so I'm very much of the opinion that, like, broadly speaking, if we have a choice between model-based RL and model-free RL, it's clear to me that a system that can give us essentially, a readout of what it's trying to do is much, much safer. I think there are some other really interesting possibilities for accountability and governance. One of the things that we have as humans is that you can ask someone a counterfactual question, as you're describing, if the door had been locked, what would you have done? And I think this is a really useful methodology, but of course people can confabulate. And there's a really interesting paper that came out of a group at DeepMind that's studying debate as a mechanism for accountability. And one of the really interesting things that you can do is clone a model and simultaneously ask both versions of the model a different question. And that cuts off certain types of confabulation. So let's say, you ask a person, if I had asked you X, what would you say? Like, let's say I claim that in one of two boxes I have hidden $1 million, and you have to pick one, and whichever one you pick, I'll give you. And you pick number one, and I show you that there was nothing in it. And then you can say to me, if I had picked number two, would there have been $1 million in it, and would you have given it to me? And I say, of course, but tough luck, sorry. What you can do, weirdly enough, with machine learning is you can, like, clone the model from the point in time before you ask the question and ask the other one, like, to reveal box number two. And so then you can create these, like, any cross-examiner's dream scenario where it's like, if I had asked you about box two, what would you have said? And you say, of course, the money was in there. It's like, aha, here is this transcript where I did ask you in a parallel universe to reveal box two, and you showed me that that one was empty also. And so there's some really interesting possibilities there for governance that doesn't exist with people because we're sort of locked into a single timeline. The final thing that I'm thinking about is you know, in the previous session on technical AI safety, there was this question that came up of whether interpretability and transparency in the case of language models is, I think, a fool's errand was the phrase that was used. I'm more bullish than I was even a few years ago about transparency methods, even for these trillion parameter transformer networks. But I think it's really critical to highlight the fact that many real world applications of AI do not require us to use trillion parameter transformer models. And the example that for me hits closest to home here is, again, criminal justice. So there is a whole push within computer science to develop extremely simple models with like a handful of parameters that are competitive and rival neural networks in accuracy on these very specific tasks. And arrest prediction, rearrest prediction is one of these things. And so there's a model from a computer scientist named Cynthia Rudin at Duke University. And the model is basically, if you're under 20 and male, predict rearrest within 2 years. Or if you're under 23 and you have 2 priors, predict rearrest. Or if you're any age and any gender, but you have 3 or more priors, predict rearrest. Otherwise, don't predict rearrest. That's the entire model. It fits into one English sentence. And it rivals for accuracy in any way that can be measured the proprietary closed source system, which is called COMPAS, which is used by many states and has been hugely controversial. And so I think, you know, from the perspective that as we increasingly mandate the use of these tools, they become in effect extensions of the law. You know, if this model's output determines whether you're released or held in jail pending your trial date, then the model is in effect, in my view, an extension of the law. And we require that the law be, you know, on the books, on the public record. And so from my perspective, there's no excuse to continue using proprietary closed source systems when the computer science has advanced to the point that extremely legible systems that could literally fit on a 3x5 note card are competitive with them. And it provides a completely different experience if you are a defendant, right? So there have been many cases where defendants have protested their COMPAS score saying, I think there was literally a typo in the data that was fed into the model, but they don't have access even to that. And so I think the good news from theoretical computer science is we don't have to live in that world. So the question from a policy perspective is, then why do we still live in that world? And I think that's an important question.
Can I just say two things? So first of all, like, why are they building computer programs when you can just have a bunch of rules? I mean, it was called we had this called the sentencing guidelines, which we then got rid of, made them advisory. And so then they moved to machine learning models. And then it was like, what the hell is that? And now we're getting, it feels like we just took law and turned it into code, but there's been no advance. It just sounds more scientific. So I say, like, I agree with you that it seems like an extension of the law, but like an unnecessary extension of the law. It's like, you know, people have a new toy, they want to play with it. So that's that. And number two, I just want to say about your notion of cross-examination. That's literally how the group considers. We have a human in the loop, which is the person who asks the model the question, because we don't know how to generate the questions yet. But we think like, actually, what would a tort lawyer do in this situation? What would they ask the human driver? We just ask the car that. So the model of cross-examination is very much the model that we use.
Great. And I think with that, we're going to open it up to questions in the room and online. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll go to you. In the back on the left there.
Thank you. I'm Talia Weiss. I'm a physics PhD student. Found this discussion really interesting. The question I have is about what impact the sort of shifts you're describing to systems like the criminal justice system using machine learning, what impact that will have on human accountability, as opposed to thinking about the accountability of the machines. So in particular, if you sort of outsource the decision making, then the sort of debate that would have to happen among people perhaps can be skipped over. And it seems like that might have advantage for policymakers who don't have to deal with the messiness, or even for individuals. An example, I think, would be, you talked about the case of, I don't remember the exact cutoff, but young males, we can say, okay, you have a higher chance of recidivism. Well, policymaker might not want to say, based on your age and the fact that you're male, we are more likely to sentence you, even if that's actually what the machine learning algorithm is doing. So I wonder what you think the impact of this is, whether there's actually positives, because maybe we'll have less heated argumentation in our society of sort of outsourcing, or whether this is really, negative overall, because we'll lose our ability to moral reason as well, or people will be resentful that they don't understand why their society is making the decisions that it is.
Yeah, I mean, either of you could respond to this, and I'll just add to that. I mean, it raises this question of, somebody builds the model. And so is the person who builds, is the car responsible when it hits, or is it the person who built the model on which the car, it became pathological, the one that's responsible for it?
Do you want to go first? I'll take a crack at it. And then I'll just, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And there are cases where use of this system can essentially atrophy the human decision maker. And I've seen this firsthand. I attended some arraignment hearings in San Francisco, where I live, shortly after a measure was passed that mandated the use of something called the Arnold tool, which is risk assessment instrument. And I went maybe a week or two after this change had gone into effect. And it was quite interesting to me to hear judges say, okay, you seem like a pretty upstanding person, but this thing that is in front of me says you're like an 8 out of 10, and that seems kind of bad. So I guess you're gonna go to jail. And that's a very strange kind of disempowering situation, where the idea is that this model informs the judge to make a better decision, but to still sort of own the decision. And what can often happen in practice is people then just sort of defer. And I think that's a problem. You see, there's another domain that came to mind when you were asking your question, which I was thinking about, which was the intelligence community. A lot of the interest and government funding for work in explainable AI has come from from DARPA by way of the intelligence community. And there were people saying, in the early 2010s, with the first kind of big boom of deep learning models for computer vision, people in the intelligence community would get these reports that would say, like, based on some model's analysis of this grainy satellite photo, we think this is like a target, sign here and we'll strike it, or something like this. And there was a lot of discomfort among the people that had to sign those papers, where they were saying, I'm in a position where I feel like I am taking some kind of moral decision here and some ownership over this outcome, but I don't really know, I don't feel that I understand the data on which this decision is based. And so that was a case that I thought was very interesting, where instead of the human decision maker just sort of allowing themselves to be disempowered, they said, no, give me something that I can sign, and know what I'm signing. And I think this is very interesting, incidentally, from perspective of how we should view the relationship between regulation and science itself. It's something that came up. Andy was talking about. There's often a view that regulation by default stifles innovation, but it's a trade-off we should make because blah, blah, blah. I think interpretable AI is a great counterexample to that entire narrative, which is, necessity is the mother of invention. Like, a huge amount of the work that has been done in the last 5 or 6 years on interpretable, explainable AI is a direct result of requirements, both within the defense community and, in the GDPR, et cetera, for a level of explainability that was scientifically impossible at the time that the requirement was enacted. And I, remembered hearing legal counsel for various tech companies going to the European Parliament and pleading with them, like, you've created a legal requirement that is impossible to satisfy because the science doesn't exist. To which the regulators just said, well, that's why you have 2 years before it goes into effect. So figure it out. And what we saw was an incredible, push of work in that space. So I think it's important to remember that regulation can actually be one of the great stimulators of scientific progress. And that's one of those cases.
So I think one of the advantages, I think, of coming to this question, like AI ethics from outside, is like you can maybe see that these questions are not like AI questions, they're just general questions, and like not get mystified. So we have like the basic question that we have is like, do you constrain decision makers, or do you give them enough discretion so that they can tailor things to particular circumstances? And so we've gone through this pinging back and forth about sentencing guidelines in criminal justice from the 1970s all the way till now. I mean, things got changed by Supreme Court. I don't know, about almost a decade ago, which now they're advisory, the sentencing guidelines, but it's the same question. It's not, the only difference is that because there's so much money in tech, and because we're mystified by technology, that we're more gullible when it comes to technology. But this is just a normal question that you would ask about regulation that they were asking in Sumeria in 300 BC. Excuse me, 3000 BC. So number two, humans in the loop. That's like a big idea in AI. It's a big idea in law. Like, there's always a human in the loop. There's always a necessity defense. There's always, like with sentencing guidelines, you had to follow the sentencing guidelines, except that there was an escape clause. If it really was a bad decision, like then you can depart. So like, this is the humans in the loop, kind of constraint on decision-making. These are just general regulatory governance questions that I'm not sure, like, there's some interesting issues having to do with AI, but they're very general questions.
I think that's a really important point, because we tend to think of these questions as sort of novel to AI, but they really aren't. No. I mean, they're kind of age-old questions, and yes, they find a new expression in AI, but it's the same problem. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to know how to apply the sort of broader set of questions and conversations to the specific area of AI. But if you're only focused in AI, you may not realize that broader scope. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Other questions? Yes, right back there. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. My question concerns how the accountability and intention framework for thinking about AI ethics generalizes when it's no longer a single entity making a decision. Yeah. So in the case of a car, I see how these tests work, and you can change the situation that it's responding to perform these tests. But if it's a complex decision, say a drone strike that's made by coordinated activity of a group of different AIs and a group of different people, it seems like that would break down. And so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to how you would assess accountability and intention in those settings.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just simply say that, like, literally got the goddamn thing to work 4 weeks ago. And Oona said, I first suggested, and then Oona said, why don't I do a demo here? But then the output is so ugly we're so in early times. But I will say one thing. I mean, a lot of my earlier career was exactly on this question: shared intention. How do we think about the intentions of people to get together to go to a conference or something like that? And I spent a lot of time and wrote a lot of words, and other philosophers of action have written similarly about these things. And so we have a much better sense, I think, about what it means when a group of people intend to act together. And so then, like, the thought was, like, could we implement that? I mean, the thing's going to break at some point. It's not going to work and I just want to know where, like, we're just trying to make the model more and more complex to see where it breaks. So I'm just telling you like the very first thing, but at least I would say that the methodology has resources for addressing the question you asked.
And it's an example of the same kind of, same point that we made earlier, which is, you know, we think about this question of shared intent in other contexts. Right. AI is just, again, another expression of this.
That's right. That's a perfect, right. So like climate change, you know, that's a great one. Like who do you sue for climate change, or pharmaceuticals? You know, there's market share liability questions. I mean, there's like, as Oona just pointed out, right, this is like our bread and butter. And I would just say about the alignment problem, okay, literally our job, that's what we teach our students to exploit. You know, like somebody writes a policy and you're like, okay, how can we hack that? You know, like, so again, these are like just general things. And like, in some sense, our professional mission is to exacerbate the alignment problem in one area.
Well, and I'll just say that for students in the room and watching online, it's also explains why it's so important to develop what we sometimes call peripheral vision, right? So understanding kind of where you fit more broadly within the context and where the question that you're asking fits within a broader set of fields and, you know, set of questions. If you're just thinking about it in this very kind of narrow sense, you're not going to understand the fact that actually this question has been asked in a lot of different contexts and it's a species of a broader problem. So thinking about your research questions and your work questions, you know, understanding kind of your broader context, not just your narrow context, is so important. So additional questions, or do you have some online that you want to go to, Ted? Let's take a couple more in person. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, this has been great. And I kind of just wanted to ask, because Brian mentioned that basically there's certain models, like for instance, assessing whether or not you'll be rearrested, that can be summarized very simply. And I was kind of wondering, you know, how much is that generalizable to a lot of different models? Like how many different models can be summarized so simply and with such simple rules? And I was just also trying to wonder whether or not that's just exposing human heuristics or things like that exist, and especially in certain fields like medicine, we've already seen, or like judging whether or not someone will be rearrested, where usually this person takes very short period of time to make this judgment. Usually they're based off of some sort of like visual or sensory input that can be summarized very simply. And like another example I'll give is if maybe I'm like writing a program to be like university health care provider, like if I see a young woman between the ages of 18 and 22 that has saying they are having problems breathing, I'll just tell them they have anxiety. I say that just because in my experience, no matter if you have pneumonia, bronchitis, flu, if you're a young woman in that age range, they tell you you have anxiety. And so I don't know if that's just exposing, you know, the issues of the heuristics that humans are using in certain fields that are more prone to that, rather than that across the board you can summarize machine learning with like simple heuristics.
I would say as like a initial intuition, a good starting point for thinking about where simple rules are applicable or, you know, competitive against the more complex approaches, is to think about the dimensionality of the input, meaning how many variables are going into the system in order to make a decision. So for something like medical diagnostics, a low dimensional situation would be like, here's your age, sex, blood type, you know, you have this symptom, yes or no, do you have that symptom, yes or no? If you can imagine putting that in like a spreadsheet, then you're in a pretty low dimensional regime. If you instead imagine like, here's a 3-dimensional, you know, tomography of this person's brain, then you're in a high dimensional situation. And so, because like each voxel of the brain is like one of the dimensions of the input. So broadly speaking, if you've got a low dimensional input, then there's a good chance that a simple rule is going to be competitive. And for many of like the most consequential things that machine learning does, the input's quite low dimensional, and health is a good example. Criminal justice is another example. There's something else I was going to say, but it escapes me. So I'll leave it at that.
Why don't we go to our online questions?
Sure. And this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much, Oona, Brian, and Scott. your comments early in the session, Brian, about how you were worried about NLP, public discourse sort of at scale, really just sort of corrupting our understanding of verifiability and disinformation. We have a bunch of questions about this. And one is about, if this is going to be a sort of increasing problem, are you going to create a sort of feedback problem where the data itself is now corrupted for AI models? So, how do we sort of deal with real person data if we're going to need that to sort of train these models in the correct direction? Is this a future problem you might envision?
Yeah, this is a present problem that I might envision. You've seen this even with the previous generation of systems. So one of the real natural language processing marquee successes of 10 years ago was Google Translate. And this was before they were using giant transformer networks. This was just using a giant corpus of human translation. So often they use the minutes of the UN, I believe, which is like very high quality translation into a large number of languages. And so the system would say, if you typed in something and you say, translate this to French, it would sort of look for fragments of that English that had appeared in this database of UN minutes and just sort of plug in the translation of French that had been used in that previous case. And this was so successful that a large amount of the text online in other languages was actually the output of Google Translate. So when they started scraping the web for further data of similar passages in different languages, there was this real danger of like the snake eating its tail, because a significant percentage of what was out there had been produced by their own model. And so it's just confirmation bias in this weird feedback loop. And I think you see a similar thing. I think that's broadly a danger with all sorts of machine learning. Certainly it's the case that already there's a huge amount of text on the web that is produced by low quality language bots. So if we have our high quality language bots learning to speak like that, then we haven't gone anywhere. So I think that's a very real danger. And you see the same thing even with something like photography. There are, I mentioned this yesterday, but smartphone cameras are surprisingly aggressive in terms of what they consider like a canonical photograph to look like. And they will play all sorts of games with the data coming into the phone sensor to sort of improve the look of the photograph, whether that is denoising it, which can sometimes delete falling snow in the sky, or it's color correcting it, which can sometimes make a very unusual sky look like a generic Crayola blue when you look at the photograph. And not only is this sort of an immediate harm to the people taking the photograph, but as you say, and as the questioner has said, these photographs taken in 2022 will be the training data of the photographic models that are deployed in 2023 and 2024. And so I think that is one of the fundamental issues with AI, that these models are now being deployed at a wide enough scale that their own outputs become the training data that the next generation learns from.
First of all, that's fascinating. That's just amazing. So thanks for that. Can I push back on the broader point? So if you've ever looked at a 19th century newspaper, American newspaper, let's say, it's shocking. It looks like Reddit. It's just like people just put stuff, like they just like put it in there. You're like, wait, what? Mrs. Calloway claims that Mr. O'Brien hit her. It's just like, what? Like who? So what happened? Well, we had editors. Like people got fed up with like reading these rags. And so then they got higher quality moderation, content moderation and editing. So like the question is like, what's interesting about the web and social media and like NLP and all that stuff, is that like you can do this very fast and you can do this quickly, but then like, isn't it just like people are just gonna go like, this is not worth it. Let me finally just buy a subscription to the Atlantic. I mean, why isn't that just the way it's gonna happen, the way it always happens? You democratize output, quality goes down, people need curation, new institutions arise to curate, rinse, repeat. I mean, and then new technology come along. So I guess the thing that you just mentioned though is like a real worry, because the real worry is that you're corrupting a technology. But I think just in general, the fact that like we have these things that can output like really high quality fake news, people will just get sick of that and just, move to, I'm only going to read something written by Oona.
I think we have time for one last question. If we have any questions in the room. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, on the topic of data, I wanted to ask Brian specifically, because you mentioned we're at the 100-year anniversary of statistical methods being applied in the criminal justice domain. And it's known that in this 100-year history, a lot of this data is considered dirty and racist and toxic for so many reasons. So you talked a little bit about the architecture side of using AI and machine learning in criminal justice. So I'm curious what measures are being taken to fix the issue of data.
I'm more intimately familiar with the problems than I am with the measures that are currently being taken to address them, quite honestly. I do think that there's a sense that open source, not-for-profit entities can compete, that these are, and this goes back to the earlier question about like, when is, simple interpretable models, when are they competitive with giant neural networks? And to the extent that we are coming to understand that in these domains they are, I think that opens up a space for not-for-profit groups or academic groups to compete on an equal footing against, a private corporation that's saying, we're not going to tell you what our model is because that's a trade secret. Well, the competitive landscape might change in a way that, Connecticut says, well, why would I go to you when I can just get the Yale, grad students on this, and they can build something that, is up for public review or public scrutiny or something like that. So I think that, from my perspective, is one of the more encouraging trends. But I think broadly, this is a pretty long-term issue. One of the things that's, particularly difficult from a data perspective about the criminal space, and there are many, but one is that if you detain someone, then you don't get to know whether they would have, been rearrested or not. And so this is, an interesting example of a case where the model makes a decision, and that decision then affects the counterfactual data that you would have gotten. And one of the ways that people address this currently is by using the variability between different human judges. So we can look at, this judge has a pattern of being much more strict. This judge has a pattern of being much more lenient. So we can say, let's identify the people that the lenient judge released, which the strict judge would have detained. And that can give us some counterfactual evidence on whether the strict judge should or should not have detained those people. And so that's a case where the noisiness or the heterogeneity of human decisions is a really useful sanity check on the system as a whole. If we replace all of that human decision-making with its variability with a single model for the entire state of Connecticut or a single model for the US, you can see why on the one hand, that consistency is attractive, so that if you're a defendant, it's not like a dice roll of, oh shoot, I'm now in front of the strict judge. So, the consistency seems good from that perspective. But if we now have the same model, being applied across the board, then we never get the counterfactual data that might indicate that the model is being stricter than it needs to be. So I think that ends up being a huge issue. So as much as there are things that are happening that I find encouraging, I think there's more that needs to be happening. And so that's kind of my take on that space.
Well, we've unfortunately reached the end of our time. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been a part of all 3 of our sessions and 6 panels, or any part of them. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I think it's a great example of kind of fruitful questions that we can make progress on when we bring together people from so many different fields. It allows us to ask a new set of questions and hopefully make some progress. And I hope for the students who are doing work in this field, I mean, this is, as you can see, so many open and interesting questions, such a kind of open field of possibilities for all of you. And we're excited that you all are here, part of this conversation. Hopefully this has been inspiring to you as you think about what you want to do next. So please join me in thanking our panelists from today's conversation. And thank you to everyone who's been here and been listening online. It's been a great conversation.
So much. Food upstairs, lunch. Thank you so much.
Yes, please join us for lunch upstairs.
So how can I,